Chapter 41. The past is like smoke. After Huo Liancheng carried Jianyun into the room, he slowly placed her on the bed. Jianyun was having the time of her life. As her vision blurred and brightened all around her, she mewled, rubbing her face against his chest like a little stray kitten. Soon enough, the pale sheets greeted her back, and she snuggled under the warm comforter. He was about to sit up and take off her coat, but she immediately wrapped her arms around his neck. "Please don't leave," she murmured under her breath, pulling him back. Huo Liancheng suddenly fell onto the cushions from the sudden force, and their lips coincidentally brushed against each other. Just then, the faint taste of orchids and wine greeted his lips. When he looked up, he was met with Jianyun's glassy eyes, and it was as if the entire world had stopped spinning. Gone were all his thoughts as he gazed up at her, feeling as if his body was being uncharacteristically drawn to the woman on top of him. However, Jianyun didn't seem to realize what had happened. Narrowing her eyes, she slowly darted her tongue across her lips, catching the taste of cool menthol. There was something about that soft and cool feeling that made her very comfortable, and it was something that she didn't mind doing again. Not being able to take any more of her teasing, he reached out and pressed the back of her head, bringing her back to his lips. The two shamelessly made out on the bed that the woman who had just stumbled into the bedroom had gone unnoticed. From Luo Yanyan's point of view, it was as if Jianyun was the one initiating the kiss. Embarrassed, she sprinted out into the room. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her hands were becoming clammy. Suddenly, Luo Yanyan felt a weird taste running down her throat, and when she glanced at the mirror next to her, she saw that she was clenching the hard surface of her toothbrush, so hard that she had already swallowed all the foam. Eyes wide in panic, she rushed back into the bathroom to rinse herself, wishing desperately that the image she had just seen could also be washed out by the flowing tap water. Inside the room, Huo Liancheng had other plans. He turned around and pressed her under his body, feeling her warm skin brush up against his. The kiss back in the car had him addicted to her taste, and the moment their lips met once again he wasn't willing to let her go. For the first time in 6 years, Jianyun was drunk. As she found herself sinking in the mattress, she squinted her eyes only to see a shadow of a man on top of her. His dark gaze was the only thing in her mind as she kissed right back, cooperating with him. Soon enough, everything faded all around him. All he could see was the beautiful figure brushing up against his leg. Suddenly, Jianyun wasn't in the bedroom anymore. The cool breeze had been turned into hot, humid air as she found herself standing on the roadside. Broken branches and stray leaves lay across the pavements, and she blinked. This was the summer when she had graduated from senior high, the same summer when she had gotten angry with him. Immediately, her surroundings had changed, and soon enough, she was already transported inside a classroom. The college entrance examination results were out, and Jianyun was sitting at the back end of the room, biting the back of her pen. Her score was more than 100 points above the average mark, and she was known as the top scholar for humanities in their city. She stared at the blackboard, distracted amidst the loud chatter echoing around her. There were several prestigious schools offering her scholarships every now and then, but her parents still hadn't come to an agreement. Her father wanted her to study in Beijing, while her mother wanted her to apply for a slot at Tsinghua University, her alma mater. Jianyun wanted to apply for Tsinghua University as well since. "Babe, have you decided on which university you'll be applying for?" She snapped out of her thoughts and looked up. There, in front of her, stood a handsome boy in his varsity jacket. He leaned against her desk, looking at her expectantly. The strands of his hair fell to his face, blocking his bright eyes, but it seemed to have highlighted his handsomeness even more. When he spotted 2 universities in her paper, he frowned, looking disgruntled. "What's so good about Beijing? It's cold and smoggy, and the price of housing is by far the most expensive I've ever seen." Rolling his eyes, he exasperatedly threw his hands up in the air as if to illustrate his point. "Besides, Tsinghu's language department is definitely on par with the one in Beijing." "When did you become an expert?" A mischievous spark flashed in her eyes, and she smirked. "I still don't want to study at Tsinghua, but Beijing is so far away from Xing," the young man complained, pouting. He looked like a child who had just been told that he couldn't get any more Christmas presents for the day. "I still have to sit on a high-speed train for 3 hours just so I could see you. It's not fair." Besides the 2 of them, there were still a few of their classmates gathered together in groups of 2s and 3s as they discussed their respective picks. When Shu Haiyan had yelled out, most of their classmates glanced in their direction, causing her to bow her head in embarrassment. "Lower your voice," she hissed. "Besides, why would you even ride a train to see me?" "But babe, you told me that after you take the entrance exams, you'll be my girlfriend." Shu Haiyan deliberately lowered his voice. A dash of nervousness appeared in his features as he shifted closer to her. "I never said that." Her face turned bright red. "Fine, you didn't." Shu Haiyan was unable to shift his gaze from the teen in front of him. She was still 17 years old, yet even then, there was a spout of maturity in her eyes that had drawn him towards her. He reached out for her small hand, slowing his pace. I've been waiting for you for 6 years, ever since you just entered high school. Do you really not feel anything for me? She pulled back her hand. There are so many girls who like you. Why should I join them? But I don't like any of them. I like you. Shu Haiyang twisted his wrist nervously. A part of him was afraid that if Jianyun was heading to the city, she might fall in love with some other college boy. Although she was elated, she didn't show it. Shu Haiyang was a year older than her, and he was also regarded as Boshan's top student. Ever since her first day 6 years ago, he had already claimed he had feelings for her, and had promised that she was the only woman in his life. Jianyun had been young then, some might even say inexperienced about these types of things, but that still didn't stop him from pursuing her. Not only was he handsome and smart, but he also played basketball. From his junior year to senior year, he was also the president of the student council. Almost half of the female student population had declared him as their crush. In the beginning, Jianyun didn't like him. In fact, she didn't even want to speak to him. When Shu Haiyang noticed this, he was careful with his movements, nervous that she'd find fault with him and hate him even more. She actually started liking him back when they were at their spring outing, a trip to the mountain heights that was organized by their school. When she had sprained her ankle, he had patiently carried her all the way back to their cabins. Jianyun still remembered the smell of raspberries and dew as she laid against his back, moved by his actions. However, Mrs. John had always been strict with her, forbidding her from dating. You should focus on your studies. She had snapped whenever her daughter would bring it up, so Jianyun had told Shu Haiyang to wait till their college entrance exams. As the years went by, Shu Haiyang was finally admitted to Tsinghua University, and Jianyun was promoted to her 3rd year. He had only taken a break from school to return to Boshan and visit her. In her heart, she had actually wanted to take the language major under Tsinghua University if ever she was accepted. Babe, why don't you just fill out the form? When Shu Haiyang saw that she didn't make a sound, a part of him thought that it's because she didn't want to come to Qing City with him. His eyebrows had furrowed even more as he leaned against her chair, waiting for her to reply. Jianyun giggled. Wanting to tell him that she was trading him, she heard someone call out for her. Jianyun, our advisor's looking for you. He wants you to go to his office. Don't do anything. I'll be back. After warning him, she left. However, when Jianyun had returned from her office and was about to fill in her application form, she discovered that her paper had been tampered with. The university name was already filled out, Tsinghua University. The moment she saw the handwriting, her vision had gone red. Shu Haiyang had filled it out for her. It's you. She glared at him, clenching her fists. Babe. Please don't get angry. I was wrong. He hurriedly apologized, not knowing what to do. Not saying a word, Jianyun packed up her things and hurried out of the classroom. She had wanted to attend Tsinghua University, that was for sure, and she wasn't angry that he had written the name of the university. What she was angry about was that Shu Haiyang didn't even consult with her, or even tried to convince her otherwise. He simply acted on her behalf for his own selfish reasons. Perhaps she should have known by then that their relationship wasn't meant to be. Chapter 42, I Like You. After handing in the forms, Jianyun no longer cared for Shu Haiyang. No matter how many times he'd call her, she wouldn't answer. After a few days of absolutely no communication, he'd stand by their house and stare at her window like a lost man with nowhere to go. I didn't know we hired a guard. Her father would tease and bump shoulders with her, staring at the man standing by their gates. Not wanting to see his face, she decided to visit her grandmother's house for a while in Tsinghua City. However, even if she was miles away from her hometown, her father would still call and inform her that Shu Haiyang would come every night and stare at her shadowed window, and only leaving when it was daybreak. It was the hottest time of the year, and even her father was anxious about the boy getting a heat stroke. Her heart wavered after hearing this, but she still remained strong. Although she wasn't really angry, Jianyun was still uncomfortable with a man who didn't have a problem with dictating her life. Shu Haiyang may have not gone against her will, but he didn't know that. What if they had gotten together in the future, and he'd still be irresponsible enough to make these decisions without her having a say in it? It would be a recipe for disaster. Huo Liancheng was still kissing Jianyun, unaware of her thoughts. If he had known, he couldn't have afforded to let her go. There was a softness to her skin and a sweetness to her lips that made it all the more intoxicating to him. And the fact that she was kissing him back sent his entire mind into overdrive. Gone were his indifferent features as he pressed her deeper against the mattress. Jianyun and Shu Haiyang had finally met once again when she was heading to school to get her admission slip. It was a hot afternoon, she remembered when she came out of the gates, and when she did, she saw him standing by an old tree, gazing anxiously at her. In just half a month, he had lost a lot of weight. His originally bright eyes were sunken, and his usual tan skin had become gaunt. Babe, he called out pitifully, grabbing the front of her bike. Although her heart had softened, she didn't show him any kindness. Who are you calling, babe? She scoffed. Haven't you done enough? Babe, I was wrong. I really was. Please don't ignore me. If you want to be angry, fine. You can hit me. You can even scream at me. Just, please speak to me. Shu Haiyang stuttered. Even his voice had lost all its cheeriness. Instead, it had become hoarse and desolate, like a man who had gone through weeks without water. Jianyun lowered her head and gazed at his hands. They were beautiful hands. With a sigh, she stayed put, but even then, she didn't say a word. Seeing that she didn't leave, Shu Haiyang brightened up. Can we walk around Jade Dragon Lake? She got off her bike and pushed it forward. You better explain yourself, she warned, but he couldn't even give a damn. His grin had widened so much that she was starting to wonder if it had hurt his cheeks. Not hesitating, he pulled her hand and tugged her toward the park. It was at that same park where they had finally made up. It was underneath a huge banyan tree. Its dark leaves wavered over them as the nightly breeze blew the strands of her hair. And when it had struck midnight, Shu Haiyang had leaned in for a kiss. It had been their first, but it was definitely not their last. A slow smile slipped into her lips. However, time was like a bundle of sand. No matter how much she'd accumulate, it would all slip through her fingertips. Her first love, no matter how much she had thought it would be her last, had ended as soon as it had just begun. She subconsciously murmured, Shu Haiyang, I like you. Shu Haiyang, I like you. For Huo Liancheng, his name was like a bucket of ice water pouring over his head. He instantly let go of Jianyun and gazed down at her. Her face was flushed from the wine, and her plump lips were swollen from the kiss. Her glassy eyes were hazy before she had fluttered them shut. It seemed that she had already fallen asleep. Shu Haiyang, was he the reason why she kept rejecting him? Huo Liancheng couldn't tell what he was feeling at the moment. Something bubbled deep inside his chest, and he took a deep breath, as if struggling to get a hold of himself. After a moment of silence, he kissed her again, this time more fiercely, as if to expel that person from the depths of her heart. When Jianyun woke up, it was already morning. She reached out for the bedside table, planning to grab her phone and check the time. However, just as she was stretching her arms, a splitting pain ripped through her head, and she winced. Ugh, she breathed out, lying on the pillow for a very long time, till she was able to get a hold of herself. Opening her eyes, she brushed her fingers across her throat, suddenly feeling thirsty. After putting on her shoes, she walked out of the living room. Jianyun headed towards the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water, but just as she was about to drink it, she saw a person sitting by the dining table. Luo Yanyan's eyes were filled with questions and excitement, and at the sight, a sense of fear shot down her spine. Why are you looking at me like that? Instead of answering, Luo Yanyan leaned back. Do you remember how you came back last night? Last night? She frowned. She remembered accompanying Huo Liancheng to the banquet, and he had tried to invite her to dance. Then after that, she drank and chatted along with Cheng Mu's, drinking a couple of glasses of rose wine. After that, however, her memory had become foggy right after. Jianyun struggled to find out what had happened, only to pull a blank every time she tried. Giving up, she finally looked up. There was something about Luo Yanyan's mischievous smile that told her that she knew something. How did I get back? I knew you wouldn't remember it. Luo Yanyan snorted in laughter, shaking her head. I must say, Yun, you were incredibly dishonest yesterday. You told me that you didn't have a boyfriend, yet from what I could tell, that super handsome man I saw yesterday came from our apartment, didn't he? That's Ming's CEO, and he's not my boyfriend. Jianyun blinked. At first, she didn't know why her friend would mention him again, but then she thought of the party. She had been accompanied Huo Liancheng to the party last night. Since she drank too much, it was only natural for him to send her back. But then, another thought occurred to her, and she froze. She drank too much last night. Suddenly, Jianyun became nervous. Yanyan, didn't I do anything last night? Oh, not much. Luo Yanyan grinned and giggled in reply. God, you scared me to death. Breathing a sigh of relief, she downed her glass of water. At first, Jianyun had thought that her friend would say something crazy, like her singing and dancing across the room in front of him. You were just pestering him to carry you. Jianyun spat out her drink. Just when she thought that was it, Luo Yanyan couldn't suppress her laughter anymore. She punched the cushions of the sofa, trying to get a hold of herself. You even suppressed the poor guy and kissed the hell out of him, she teased, shaking her head. French kissed him, to be more specific. Jianyun was just about to go to the kitchen and wipe the table when she heard this. Her head almost slammed against the refrigerator in surprise. No, that's not possible. I wouldn't. She stared at her faded reflection in disbelief. Don't you know how you act when you're drunk? Luo Yanyan shrugged. Actually, Jianyun had a few theories in her mind as to what had happened last night, but she didn't know she could be this provocative. Her gaunt face had turned bright red, unwilling to believe that she had done all of these embarrassing things. How the hell was she even going to face him in the future? Chapter 43. Love at First Sight. At that moment, Luo Yanyan accusingly pointed a finger at her, shaking her head. You keep on saying that this super handsome guy who, by the way, had just carried you all the way to your apartment, isn't your boyfriend and doesn't have any feelings for you. If so, then why do you think he's being so nice to you? Just for the take of formalities? Jianyun followed her friend's questioning stare and saw the lover's heart resting on her chest. The dress she had on last night was already replaced with a pair of cotton pajamas, yet the necklace still remained. Licking her lips tentatively, she let her fingers trail down the surface of the diamond before looking up. These types of men are hard to get by, you know? Rich, handsome, kind. He didn't even take advantage of you when you practically threw yourself at him. Luo Yanyan snorted, shuddering as the images from last night bombarded her thoughts. He even asked me to change your clothes and wash your face before he left. If I were him, I would have given up all my senses and sleep with you. Do you think he'll allow me to throw myself at him? Upon hearing this, she scoffed. Have you seen him? Whatever. Yun, are you really going to stand there and tell me that you're not interested in him? Luo Yanyan asked curiously. What's the use of having good looks? Could it pay my bills? Hell, I see them more as a curse than a blessing. Jian Yun wiped the table clean with a rag after finishing up her glass of water. A mocking smile slid into her lips. The memories from her past played over and over again in her mind like a broken recorder. You should know that better than anyone. Although her words were vague, Luo Yanyan understood what she meant. Her bright eyes had dampened almost immediately. Not all men are the same, she disagreed. Just because Xu Haiyang cheated on you doesn't mean that every man would it. You shouldn't generalize them. Even if they were different, even if he isn't like him, it's not like I can stop other women from chasing him. And besides, why are we even discussing this? How could someone like him ever take interest in me? You know me, Yan Yan. I'm looking for a husband, someone who I could be with for the rest of my life, not someone's plaything when he's bored. Jian Yun's lips curled before chuckling upon hearing how absurd she sounded. And besides, you act as if he's interested in me when in actuality, the man already has a girlfriend, who, by the way, is our new manager. Plus, she's pregnant. Luo Yanyan faltered in disappointment, but even then, she still wouldn't give in. You've only known each other for a few days, yet it feels like he's known you for years with the way he was looking at you last night. Actually, Jian Yun had also felt that Huolian Cheng's attitude towards her was too sudden and quick for someone he had just met. At her friend's words, her heart stirred just a bit. Could she have known him before? She immediately shook her head. I'm 100% sure that I've never seen him from anywhere, she stated. Besides, it would be hard to forget someone like him. Then, maybe it really is just love at first sight. Oh, please, you say the same thing as Wu Wenjing, Jian Yun snorted. The mockery had resurfaced in her features, as her face contorted into a look filled with disbelief. The last thing she wanted to believe was to think that Huo Liancheng, the most indifferent man she had ever seen in her life, was capable of even thinking about falling in love. It's definitely not love at first sight, that I'm sure of. As they were discussing the concepts of love and the like, her phone started ringing. When Jian Yun glanced at her screen, her eyebrows shot up in surprise. It was Zhou Xiaolong. Mr. Zhou, she greeted upon picking up the phone. Haven't I already told you to call me by my name? His teasing voice sounded from the other end of the line. Calling me Mr. Zhou makes me think you're addressing my father. Sorry, I forgot. Jin Yun couldn't help but laugh. Well, are you free now? Why don't we have lunch together? Zhou Xiaolong asked. Glancing at the clock beside her, she realized that it was already past 9 o'clock. Jian Yun quickly agreed. Yeah, I'm free. Where are you staying then? I'll come and pick you up. His calm voice held a tinge of excitement upon hearing that she was going to go. There's really no need. Besides, the road is blocked on the way here, so I'll just trouble you further, she said. After all, she had only known the man for a few days. Even if she had a good impression of him, she couldn't just immediately reveal where she was staying. These things take time. I'll just take the subway. You can text me the location. Sure. After giving her the address, Zhou Xiaolong hung up. Hearing their conversation, Lu Yanyan leaned against the counter and peered at her. Is that your blind date? Tell me about him. He's just a lawyer who studied from abroad. Jian Yun turned around and walked back into her bedroom, planning to change. The drilling pain in her skull a few minutes ago had been replaced with a dull pain, one of the few symptoms of her hangover. She squinted her eyes at the piercing sunlight before turning to her closet. He went to study abroad and decided to come back and be a lawyer? Aren't their laws different from ours? Her friend pursed her lips. I don't understand. In reality, she also didn't understand why he'd do such a thing. After their first date, all she knew about Zhou Xiaolong was still mainly on surface level, and even that wasn't enough for her to describe him as a person. If they were ever going to continue dating, then she should know more about him. So you're really not considering that handsome Huo guy? Luo Yanyan entered her room. An expression of infatuation was painted all over her face as she clutched her heart. And here I thought I'll be seeing more of his handsome face in the future. You want to see him? She snorted. Let's see you try if you don't freeze to death first. Please, I can tell by your outfit that you're not interested in the lawyer you're seeing. None of them looks as good as the ones you wear in the office, she teased. And here I thought you have no interest in handsome Huo. Would you please stop calling him that? With her back facing her, Jian Yun pushed the strands of hair from her face. Besides, in work, I need to look presentable. Do you mind helping me out in taking off this necklace? Never. Giggling, Luo Yanyan unclasped the diamond necklace, peering closely at it. Such a big diamond. I don't need to be a jeweler to know how expensive this is. I think it's sweet that he gave this to you. I just accompanied him to the banquet, so he borrowed this to me. I'll return it to him tomorrow. Are you sure? Crossing her arms, Luo Yanyan pointed at the headboard of her bed with her chin. She didn't look too convinced by her friend's excuse. He left the jewelry box behind. It means that he's giving it to you already. Jianyun blinked. She hadn't noticed the jewelry box near her nightstand. At that moment, she couldn't help but glance at the gold necklace sitting on the palm of her hand. Could it be that Huo Liancheng was actually giving her the lover's heart? Otherwise, why else would he leave it behind? But why would he give it to her? Of all people? Even the sight of the velvety box was enough to make her believe that the necklace was unbelievably expensive. Although he was rich, he didn't look like someone who'd just hand off money to a stranger. I can tell from the way that he looks at you that he's a good man. Why don't you think about it? Patting her shoulder, Luo Yanyan turned to leave. Jianyun picked up the jewelry box, letting her fingers dance across the velvety surface before opening it up. Even the inside was beautiful, with its satin cloths and an embroidered pillow in the center. Placing the diamond necklace back inside the box, she found herself staring at the blood-like diamond for what seemed like a century before she finally closed it. Even if it was a gift, she couldn't accept it. She would have to return it to him tomorrow, once she had gotten to work. Half an hour had passed when Jianyun finally arrived at the location. There were various people crowding around the street, but she could see Zhou Xiaolong standing under the tree by the roadside, making a phone call. As she walked over, she saw that he was dressed even more meticulously than he had been back on their first date. He was wearing a well-ironed suit and dark leather shoes. His hair was glossy under the sunlight, looking as if he had put on too much hair gel. Suddenly, Huo Liancheng crossed her mind. His hair was far shorter than Zhou Xiaolong. It would be difficult to run her hand through his hair, if that were the case. Just then, Jianyun reeled back, shuddering. What the hell was she just thinking? Why would she even touch his hair? Blinking, she shook her head, as if trying to cleanse herself from the mere thought. Hey, I didn't hear you arrive. Zhou Xiaolong, who had been on his phone this entire time, immediately turned around. His eyes widened as he jolted back, looking as if he had just been struck by lightning. Lowering his voice, he whispered into his phone. Something came up. We can talk about this later. With that, he quickly hung up. Jianyun looked up at him, noticing the anxiety painted all over his face. His arms were fidgety and his eyes were glancing from left to right. Why was he acting so nervous? Was he afraid that she'd hear his phone call? Jianyun, did you? He carefully observed her expression, hesitating. I just arrived, she quickly said, not thinking too much about it. After all, everyone had their own secrets. Relieved, Zhou Xiaolong glanced at his watch and grinned. It's my work. I couldn't afford to stay idle even on the weekends, since my boss is ringing me up left and right, he explained, chuckling. It's still 10 in the morning, far too early for lunch. Do you want to head to the mall first? Chapter 44. Do you want to accept it? Sure. Jianyun nodded in agreement. Although Zhou Xiaolong seemed to have left a good impression on her, it wasn't to an extent that she liked him. For her, he was just another acquaintance she had gotten to know, and a walk around the mall was certainly a good way to pass the time. Since breaking up with Xu Haiyang, she had been single for around 6 years. Ever since then, she had been going on tons of blind dates, just to please her mother. But she had deliberately made herself look ugly every single time. While the Jianyun had certainly never gone shopping with a stranger before. This was certainly a first, and she was not used to the feeling. Fortunately, Zhou Xiaolong was very talkative, so the atmosphere wasn't all that awkward. As the two of them strolled around the department store, there were tons of men who would give her the second look. Unlike the other women with heavy makeup and suffocating perfume, she already had dark eyelashes and rosy cheeks. Her beauty was as clear as day, like a flower in its everlasting bloom. She was certainly eye-catching. Noticing the envious looks thrown at him, Zhou Xiaolong grinned and walked even closer to her. Even he didn't expect that he'd be introduced to such a beautiful woman when he had been asked to go on a blind date. Who knew that taking a shot could win him the lottery? Jianyun, why don't you pick out a dress, he said, pointing to one of the racks. I'll buy it for you. There's really no need. Besides, I just bought some clothes a few days ago. Jianyun tactfully refused. Her refusal had only satisfied Zhou Xiaolong even more. Even with her good looks, she still wouldn't take advantage of the man she's with. She was certainly every man's ideal wife. It seemed that he had really discovered a treasure this time around. The two strolled around for a while. Noticing that it was already getting late, they found a Xinjiang cuisine restaurant at the other side of the mall and decided to eat there instead. Just as she was done ordering the dishes, Jianyun habitually tied her hair up with a scrunchie. After ordering the first 2 appetizers, she passed over the menu to Zhou Xiaolong, only to see that he was staring in her ear. A weird mix of awe and curiosity was painted over her face that she couldn't help but furrow her eyebrows. What's wrong? She subconsciously touched her ear. It was only then she realized that she had forgotten to take off her earrings. Is that a pink diamond? His eyes twitched. That must be very expensive. Ah, no, it's fake. Jianyun faked a smile. How could she tell the truth that the diamonds on the earrings were the same as the lover's heart? Yesterday, even the rich and famous were surprised to see such a rare and expensive diamond hanging on her neck. If she'd told him the truth, he might misunderstand her. Ah, well, that's good. Upon hearing her words, he breathed a sigh of relief. Only a few seconds had passed when he noticed how wrong he must have sounded. Immediately, he waved his hands up in the air. I didn't mean any offense, of course. It's fine. Why don't we order some more food? I'm hungry. And that was the end of their conversation. After they finished ordering, they waited for a while. Zhou Xiaolong went to the bathroom, and Jianyun decided to play with her phone for a while in complete boredom. However, as her fingertips brushed against her earrings, her heart was suddenly moved. She opened up Baidu and typed in the words, lover's heart. The first entry that had popped up was an encyclopedia. When Zhou Xiaolong had finally returned, he found Jianyun staring blankly at her phone. What are you looking at? He asked, but she still didn't respond. He knocked on the table again, and Jianyun looked up as if she had just woken up from her stupor. What are you looking at? Zhou Xiaolong asked with a smile. Oh, it's just a novel that I've been reading for a while. The author just posted another chapter. As if right on time, the waiter had started to hand out the dishes. She used this time to slip her phone back into her bag. However, that still didn't stop her from getting lost in her thoughts. Xinjiang cuisine was truly distinctive and tasty. The dishes were all sprinkled with the right amount of spices and cooked at just the right temperature. However, Jianyun was far too absent-minded to even notice it. She'd pick around her food from time to time, nodding silently at Zhou Xiaolong's jokes every now and then. She still couldn't help but bring her fingers to her earrings, tweedling around the diamond lying perched on her skin. Once they were finished eating, it was still early, so he suggested that they should go to the movies while they were at it. Agreeing with him, they bought 2 tickets from the popular movie, The Mermaid. It was actually a funny movie with its fantasy themes and crazy characters. Everyone in the movie theater, including Zhou Xiaolong, would laugh foolishly as film flashed from screen to screen. Howls and screams echoed throughout the theater as they enjoyed the film. Yet, no matter how much she tried to concentrate and laugh along with them, she still seemed slightly out of sorts. How could she concentrate when all she could think about was the entry she had just looked up about the lover's heart? It was said that the diamond was famous not only because of its price, being the most expensive diamond in Sotheby's history, but also because of the special meaning behind it. It was said to have been sold to a mysterious buyer for $120 million a year ago in an auction. No one knew who it was. Of course, until the night of the banquet. There was a legend wrapped around the lover's heart. Back then it was said that there was a prince and a woman who had loved each other so much, but when the war had broken out, the prince was forced to lead his troops to battle behind him. When news had gotten back to the palace, it was reported that the prince had died from the fight, and the woman died from grief upon hearing the news. However, it came as a surprise to everybody that the prince had been saved. When he ran into the palace gates, he was only met with the corpse of his beloved. He had cried and cried, yet none of them could assuage him. In the end, he had cut open his chest and placed his heart right next to his lover. The grand act had moved even the gods themselves, that the prince had lived despite ripping out his heart, and they had even brought the girl to life. The heart that had been cut out turned into a diamond, its pink hue symbolizing the blood trapped under the hard metal. In the end, the 2 of them lived happily ever after. Therefore, this diamond had another name, Loyalty Heart. Everyone knew that the legend was merely just that the auctioneers were simply trying to raise the price by adding a more mythical feel to the jewelry. However, the meaning behind the diamond was real. Loyalty, was that what Huolian Cheng was trying to tell her? She clutched the side of her head, suddenly having a headache. After the movie had ended, Zhou Xiaolong noticed that Jianyun was still distracted. He frowned. Are you not feeling well today? Why aren't you in a good mood? She turned to look at him. Under the dim lighting, she could still see the corners of his handsome face, but she also noticed that his eyes had considerably darkened. It was really cold last night, probably gave me a headache, she explained. It wasn't totally a lie. Jianyun really had a headache, but it wasn't because of the cold, but because of Huolian Cheng's confusing behavior. There really was no telling her as to what to expect from him. You should go home and rest then, he said considerately, placing a hand on her shoulder. How about I'll send you off? There's no need. My uncle's house is nearby, she smiled. I'll just go there. Okay. Take care of yourself, Zhou Xiaolong said once again before walking away. It was already past 3 o'clock and Jianyun still had to head over to her student's home at 4:30. After they had finally separated, she decided to go to a nearby cafe and order herself a cup of coffee. She sat there, staring blankly at the white magnolia blooming outside the window. She had always been living a quiet life, with her heart unperturbed. Yet there was something about Huolian Cheng's presence that had set her off. He was like a fire coursing through her system, one that she couldn't easily remove. No, she couldn't accept a man like him into her life. After everything that had happened, she had realized that a man like him was just far too bright. He was like a sun shining in the sky, and all she'd be left with was to just stand in his shadow like a lifeless puppet. She had already lived that life, and she realized that she needed something far more than that. Now all she ever wanted was to live a normal and ordinary life. After what her mother had been through, all she could see in men were potential problems, potential threats to her already broken heart. Therefore, Jianyun stayed away from them as much as she could. After all, she already had enough problems on her plate. When Jianyun left the cafe, the coffee was already cold to touch, and she still didn't drink a single sip. Besides, she had never liked coffee. After living such a bitter life, why would she need another taste of bitterness? Chapter 45. Encountering perverts on the road. As Jianyun sat at the back of the taxi, she found herself staring at the beautiful villas displaying themselves around her. Most of the people living within this residence belonged to the upper class or work in foreign embassies. Chloe's parents belonged to the latter, working in the French embassy at Qinghu City. The 10-year-old was incredibly talented and had played the piano for around 5 years already, and Jianyun had always enjoyed coaching her. "We're here, miss." The driver had finally dropped her off Chloe's villa. Even if she had been there numerous times in the past, Jianyun had always admired the subtlety of the villa. It was beautiful, yet it wasn't as grand as the other mansions around the street. The white columns greeted her as she rang the doorbell. "You're here." A young girl with curly brown hair and bright blue eyes rushed to the doorstep. She immediately latched herself on the older woman's leg, screaming excitedly, "I missed you." "Chloe, you look absolutely gorgeous today." Jianyun held the little girl in her arms as they walked around the mansion, skillfully communicating with her in French. "How have you been?" "Jianyun, is that you? Come on in." Mrs. Bernard walked right out of the kitchen, pulling her into a hug. Jianyun and Mrs. Bernard had known each other for around 3 years. When the Bernard family had first arrived in Qinghu, they wanted to hire a piano teacher to continue Chloe's piano lessons, but since they didn't know how to speak Chinese, they needed to find someone who understood French. No matter where they searched, they couldn't find anyone who could satisfy their demands. It was only by chance when someone had introduced Jianyun to Mrs. Bernard. She had practiced the piano ever since she was a little kid and had passed the 10th level. Although she didn't have any music degree, she had a professional background in playing the instrument, and since she also knew French, Mrs. Bernard was satisfied enough. After deciding on the salary, the pair had worked with each other ever since. Jianyun came by once every week, and Mrs. Bernard, being the considerate woman she was, made sure that she would come in the afternoon. This was to make sure that she'd be able to return home by 7 at night. After all, it was dangerous for a woman to walk around at night, even in a safe community such as this one. Chloe was such a talented pianist, so it was easy for Jianyun to teach her. By the time the young girl had learned the 2 pieces assigned to her, the 2 hours had already passed. "Jian, has your mother already been operated on?" Once the lesson was over, Mrs. Bernard invited her to have a cup of tea. They sat on the sofa with the little girl sitting in between the 2 women. "I have an appointment with one of the best doctors in the capital, but he's out of the country at this time, so we're still waiting." Sighing, she took a sip from her tea. Although Jianyun didn't mind waiting, she still couldn't help but wonder what was taking so long. Chloe snuggled up to her, and she ran her fingers down the young girl's golden brown hair. Mrs. Bernard smiled. "Well, if you need any help, don't hesitate to ask me, okay?" "I will, thank you." She bowed her head and ruffled Chloe's head affectionately. "All right, Chloe, I have to head home now. I'll see you again next week." "You're already leaving?" Chloe pouted, tugging her wrists. "Didn't you say that you'd take me hiking? Can't you stay for a bit at least?" "That's right. If you're free next week, you should come over a little earlier. I could introduce you to a good friend of mine." Knowing that Jianyun wouldn't stay for dinner, Mrs. Bernard didn't insist any further. Instead, she suggested an alternative. "Sure, who's your friend?" The Bernard family was quite a powerful family back in France, so their connections usually counted rich and influential politicians and businessmen. However, Jianyun had never really gotten acquainted with any of them. "She's my best friend. You'll definitely like her." Mrs. Bernard flashed a smile. "Well, we shouldn't keep you any longer. Hopefully, we'll see you next week, all right? Don't be a stranger." The bus stop wasn't far away from the residential area, so Jianyun decided to walk all the way there. By the time she had left, the sun had already set. The hot and humid atmosphere was soon replaced by strong winds, biting her bare skin. She hadn't brought a jacket that day, thinking that it was going to be warm, but it seemed that this wasn't the case. Cursing under her breath, she crossed her arms and shivered as she waited for the bus to arrive. 20 minutes had passed, and the bus still hadn't arrived. Jianyun leaned against the post, sighing in frustration. Since this was a more private residence, there weren't many buses passing around the area. Sometimes, a bus would stop over if there were any construction projects going on, but other than that, public transportation wasn't the most popular choice to get in and out of the complex. Forget it, Jianyun thought helplessly. There was no use to wait for the bus here anyway. so she might as well wave for a taxi. Even then, she couldn't help but be a little hesitant. To save for her mother's future expenses, Jinyun had been working like crazy to earn some money in the last few years. She didn't dare spend a single cent, even if it was for her own convenience. Despite this, she had only managed to raise enough for her mother's initial surgery. Her recovery, on the other hand, was another matter. This was why she lived a more frugal way of life. However, it seemed that luck wasn't on her side today. The bus still hadn't arrived, and the taxi still hadn't crossed by the intersection. Now, Jianyun had no other choice but to walk towards the next block and wait there instead. Instead of a taxi greeting her sights like what she had wanted, a fancy red sports car stopped right in front of her. "Hey, hottie, want to hitch a ride?" A young man with large sunglasses whistled at her. He lowered down his windows and peered at her like a predator looking at his snack. Jianyun simply ignored him and continued walking. "Hard to get, eh? Just how I like it." He still didn't give up. Instead, he continued to move his car even slower, hoping to catch her attention. Feeling his gaze sliding down her backside, a shiver shot down her spine. She took a deep breath, trying her best to calm herself. "Why don't you come here and have the ride of your life? Come on, baby doll, I don't bite. Not unless you want me to, of course." His words were growing more and more vulgar, and by the time she had reached an alleyway, she already had enough of him. Curling her fingertips, Jianyun finally looked up. The flickering streetlights shrouded all around her like shadows guarding her every move. She turned her head over to him and beckoned him over with a finger. A flirty smile slipped into her lips. "As long as you do me good, you can have anything you want." The young man finally got off the car. Although the streetlights were broken, he could make out her high cheekbones and plump lips. He was immediately stunned, and his eyes widened. "You're beautiful. Like what you see?" She tilted her finger and motioned him to come closer, slinking into the darkness. "Oh, I like it, beauty. Wait till I have my fun with you." The man had thought that he finally won the lottery as he began to unbutton his shirt. So many thoughts ran through his mind as he let his eyes travel down the curves of her hips, then to her ass. He licked his lips. It was going to be one lucky night for him. However, just as he was undoing his buttons, he was suddenly punched in the right eye. The man stumbled back from surprise, but before he could recover, his left eye was also struck. "What the?" He swung his fists to the right, but before he could hit him, his arm was blocked. The seemingly weak beauty had dodged her throws and slammed the back of her palms onto his arms and threw him over her shoulder, slamming him onto the pavement. His back rubbed against the hard surface, and he screamed in pain. "Still like me?" She stroked the side of his face, squatting over him. "No, I don't like you anymore." The man stammered, not saying another word to offend her. After all, he was already lying on the ground, so he had no other choice but to back down and do her bidding. But that didn't mean he wouldn't hire someone else to teach this bitch a lesson. Just you wait, he thought. "But I'm so pretty, yo." Jinyun pouted, slapping him 2 times, one on each cheek. He blinked. He couldn't like her. He also couldn't say he disliked her. What the hell did she want? Who is this crazy woman? "Take off your clothes." She stared at the bruised man lying in front of her, face darkening. The man didn't know what she was planning anymore. Did she have a fetish or something? He thought, but he didn't dare disobey her. Instead, he quickly took off all his clothes readily. He was a man, and he wasn't going to lose out on a good ride, that was for sure. "Don't take off your underwear." Wrinkling her nose, she turned her head. "What? But..." However, when he saw her pulling out her phone, he suddenly had a bad premonition. "What? What are you doing?" Chapter 46, If you don't like it, just throw it away. Ignoring his quaking figure, Jianyun fished out his ID card from his wallet and gave it to him. "Take it." She held her phone close to her side, planning to take a picture of his humiliated face. If the man disagreed, then she'd happily slap him twice. After all, what's a small picture compared to all the things that she knew he would have done to her if she hadn't stopped him? It was obvious that the man had bad intentions. He thought that just because he had a sports car and an expensive suit, he could get away with anything. She gnashed her teeth together. If there was one thing she planned to do tonight, it was to teach him a lesson. After all the words he had thrown at her, this was only right. If he had met another girl tonight, who would have known what he'd do? "I know I'm wrong. Please, just let me go," he cried bitterly, hiding his snot-filled face. The cockiness was long gone from his system and was replaced with total desperation. The phone flashed, and the bright light almost blinded him as he struggled to sit back up. He squinted his eyes. "Please, I'm sorry. I can pretend nothing happened tonight, but if you dare try to seek me out, then I'll post all these photos of you online." Jianyun purposely walked up to the man and showed him the photos she had taken. All of them were pictures of him lying down on the pavement, his piteous naked body out in the open. His eyes were swollen, and his cheeks were smeared with dirt. The sight of it was enough to make anyone throw up. "I'll let the whole world know who you are." The man could only squeeze his eyes shut, nodding in agreement. "Now, since we've reached an agreement, why don't you get up and put some clothes on so you can send me to the nearest subway station?" As if nothing had happened, she kicked him one last time and slipped her phone into her pockets. Jian Yun was well aware of what these men usually do in their spare time. They'd climb up their world-class mansions and spend the time drinking and spending without a single care in the world. However, if there was one thing they'd be scared of doing, it's causing a scandal. If they had done anything to shame their family name, then their resources would be cut off. It was almost as worse as the death penalty for them. A smirk slipped into her lips. This was why she had done what she did. After all, if he was willing to play dirty, then so was she. I think I'm suffering from internal bleeding. Although the man had already put on his clothes, he couldn't help but clutch his chest. The pain soared through his very veins, climbing up to his arms and neck. Every move made him flinch. I need to get to the hospital. Oh, cut the crap. I know what I was doing. I didn't hurt you. Waving her phone as a warning, she forced him into the car. The young man would always come out at night and lurk around the corner to see if he could seduce any pretty lady in his midst. However, not only had he failed tonight, but he had also been beaten up. Bitter from this, he made sure to slow down at the sight of any surveillance camera, just to make sure that he could rewind them and see her face. Although he may not be able to get back at her tonight, he'd be sure to take his revenge the next time they'd see each other. Don't even think about trying to fool me. Jian Yun was smart enough to know what he was planning. That was why she had already taken out her mask and hat to cover her pale face. Seeing that the man was purposely slowing down, she grabbed the bobblehead in front of them and pointed it at his crotch. If you still want to have kids, then I suggest you start following my rules. The man could only bow his head and follow. He gripped the ends of his steering wheel, feeling his anxiety eating up every inch of his heart. How could he have such bad luck? Once they had arrived at the subway station, she found a secluded place for them to park in. We're here. Stop the car. Barking out, she stepped out of the car and threw the bobblehead at his face. Without the slightest bit of hesitation, she slipped into the crowd. The man clenched his jaw and took out his phone. At first, he wanted to call out his men to seek her out and take revenge, but just as he was about to dial their numbers, he hesitated. If people knew that he, Mr. John, was beaten up to the point that he couldn't up by a woman of all people, they were never going to let him live this down. Taking a deep breath, he gritted his teeth and turned away. He should deal with this himself. Jian Yun took the subway back home, and by the time she had finally arrived, it was already 8:30. Although Luo Yanyan wasn't there, the food was already prepared. She quickly started to eat. After the long and interesting days she just had, all she wanted was to bury her head in a warm bowl of rice. During this time, she even received a phone call from Zhou Xiaolong, asking her if she was free tomorrow. I might need to work overtime, so I'm still not sure, she had said before hanging up and hurrying to the bathroom to take a shower. By the time she was finished with all the necessities, it was already 10 o'clock. Jian Yun yawned as she slipped under the covers. Although she was exhausted, she still couldn't fall asleep. No matter how much she tossed and turned around her bed, Huo Liancheng's face would pop in her thoughts every now and then, as the legend of the lover's heart repeated over and over again like a broken recorder. Subconsciously, she took out the velvet box from under her pillow and pulled out the pink diamond necklace. As her thumb grazed against the glittering surface, she couldn't help but think, if this diamond really was hers, maybe she didn't have to work as hard. Perhaps, if she had sold this, she and her mother would finally be able to live their own happily ever after for many more lifetimes ahead. Maybe then, they'd both be happy. Blinking, Jian Yun shook her head, rubbing the creases in her forehead. No, the diamond was far too precious to be sold just like that, and its meaning, she couldn't take it. Thinking of this, she grabbed her phone from the bedside table and stared at Huo Liancheng's name for a long time, wondering if she should call him. A few seconds later, she shook her head and opened her WeChat. It was better to text him instead. Just the thought of talking to him was already giving her anxiety. When Jian Yun opened her WeChat, she saw thousands of unread messages, many of them coming from her high school group. The chat had about 2,000 unread messages in the past 2 days alone. Rolling her eyes, she ignored them and pressed on Huo Liancheng's profile. The last thing she needed was any more gossip from her classmates. President Huo, are you there? She sent a message over. 5 minutes later, he finally replied, yes. Jian Yun paused for a bit before replying to him, when are you free? So that I could return the necklace. This time, Huo Liancheng didn't reply. Just as she thought that he had fallen asleep, her phone started ringing. Her heart raced to her chest as she clenched her fingers around her phone. Why couldn't he just text like any normal person? Gritting her teeth, she answered, President Huo. Don't you like it? Huo Liancheng asked, and she had to lean in closer to her speaker for her to hear it. There were faint honks and chatter in the background from the other end of the line. It seemed as if he was walking. What? Don't you like the necklace? His voice was still as cold as ever. Jian Yun froze. It's too precious. I can't just... If you don't want it, then you can just throw it away. Her eyes twitched violently. The necklace, from what she had searched, was worth 102 billion. And he wanted her to just throw it away? Was he being serious? Did he assume that these diamonds just grow on trees sewed between them, as Jian Yun struggled to come up with a better response. But at this point, she found herself at a loss for words. Is there anything else? Huo Liancheng prompted. Speechless, she slowly shook her head. No, there's nothing else. Not waiting for her to say anything more, he hung up. He was angry. That was already obvious from the way he had phrased his words. Jian Yun stared at her darkened screen and a thought suddenly occurred to her. Was he angry that she didn't want to accept his gift? Putting her phone down, she lied back on her bed in a daze, staring at the beautiful diamond. Under the moonlight, it glistened even brighter, as if a little angel was trapped inside this beautiful gem. How could she not like the pink diamond? Hell, if she had a choice, she'd keep and guard this with all her life. But why would he give her something this expensive? Did he want anything from her in exchange? She slowly shook the thought away. Obviously, Jian Yun wasn't planning on throwing the necklace. Instead, she decided to keep it for now. Maybe she could ask Cheng Mu's to return it to Huo Liancheng tomorrow. Perhaps this was better done indirectly. However, that single phone call had agitated her even more that she couldn't fall asleep, so she opened her Weibo. It had taken her half an hour of scanning and reading various posts that showed up on her feed before she had finally drifted off. The next morning, when Jian Yun arrived at the company, Wu Wenjing skipped towards her. Yun, she sang, spinning around. How do I look? Notice anything different today? Pausing, she looked at her friend up and down before shaking her head. No, why? Don't you think I'm prettier today? Happier, perhaps? Wu Wenjing leaned closer to her desk. Jian Yun shook her head once again. No? Her answer sounded more like a question than a statement. You're so annoying. Sighing, Wu Wenjing squeezed in next to her before whispering in her ear, I bumped into one of my high school classmates the day before yesterday, and he's now working in the entertainment industry. He's asking if I'm interested to act in one of his films, so of course I said yes. Now, get this. He's asking me to come to his company for an interview in a few days. Are you finally going to become a celebrity then? Jian Yun teased, raising her eyebrows. Chapter 47. The Table Be Pry. I could start off as a model, but he said that he can give me an acting job as one of his extras to help hone my acting skills. First, I'll play a supporting role, and next thing you know, I'll be the female lead at one of the most popular movies of all time. Wu Wenjing's face was filled with anticipation and excitement for the upcoming interview. Her eyes shone even more brightly as she tried to suppress her giggling. Yun, you look absolutely gorgeous. Why don't you join me for an interview? She beamed. I'm sure my friend will agree to it. No, the limelight never suited me anyway. Jian Yun waved her hands repeatedly, shaking her head. It will in time. Besides, aren't you short on money? Have you seen how rich all these celebrities are? They're being paid at least 200,000 to 300,000 RMB for just a single episode. I could work overtime every day, and I still wouldn't be able to earn as much in just 1 year. Wu Wenjing protested, tugging her arm. She exasperatedly threw her hands up in the air. Look at you, you're so pretty. You'll definitely be popular. I'm not interested in any of the sorts. Snorting, Jian Yun turned away. After all these years of being a wallflower, she was no longer used to being the center of attention. And my mother wouldn't agree to this. And here I thought I could drag you along. Wu Wenjing sighed in disappointment. You should think this through, though. See if the person's reliable or not. After all, there were plenty of women who shared the same dream of making it big just to be fooled in the end. Although there were plenty of legitimate offers, there was still a lot of shady gigs on the side one that could put an end to their dreams. Okay? Please, we grew up together. He wouldn't lie to me, but I am planning to check out his company first. Wu Wenjing wasn't naive enough to question her friend's advice. She nodded, crossing her arms over her chest. After all the scandals they had been hearing on the news of young girls being taken advantage of by these scouting agencies, it was best to look out for them. As the office was starting to fill up, Wu Wenjing returned to her seat. Since today was Monday, their manager was supposed to hold a start-of-the-week meeting to update them on any new dealings and projects. At around 9:30, Xia Bingbing appeared in the department. Her secretary, who had been trailing behind her this entire time, clapped her hands to alert everyone of her arrival. Everyone lifted their heads in acknowledgement, but they didn't look too pleased with her arrival. Xia Bingbing was still as domineering as ever. Although she had just been here for a couple of days, the personnel department had already received some complaints about her. Now, the rumors they had been hearing about the woman being the granddaughter of Ming's chairman seemed to be truer than ever. Otherwise, with her level of skill, how could she have entered the company, much less become the department manager? It's either that, or it's because she was carrying Huo Liancheng's baby. In order to make her presence known, the crazy woman had been causing all kinds of trouble in the HR department. Not only did she drill down on Jian Yun, but also on the other employees under her. Although everyone in the HR department was capable of writing up a quality report for her, she had spared no one as she trashed them all. Xia Bingbing, if anything, was far too underqualified for the job given to her. Although Li Shangran wasn't the best HR manager, he was still more capable than her. Xia Bingbing glared at Jian Yun once she had finished her lecture, but the young woman could care less. Flicking dirt from her table, she turned away. At this point, the last thing she needed was to pick a fight with this rabid woman. There was more work lined up for her on Monday, so she had been busy the entire morning. When it was finally time for lunch, she waited for everyone to leave before picking up her phone from her desk. She called for Wu Wenjing to stop as her friend was heading right out the door. Without another thought, Jian Yun dialed Cheng Mu's number. Sister Jian, to what do I owe the pleasure of your call? His voice sounded light from the other end of the line. Brother Zhe, are you in the company? He chuckled. Why? Is there something you want me to do? Jian Yun paused for a second, carefully phrasing her words. Do you mind helping me hand over something to President Huo? There was a moment of silence before he finally spoke up. What is it? The necklace. Knowing that it was impossible to hide the truth from him, especially since he was the one who's going to hand it over, she decided to come clean. After all, beating around the bush could only lead to even more misunderstandings between them. Isn't that fourth brother's gift to you? Cheng Mu asked curiously. Don't you like it? It's not that, it's just too valuable. I can't accept it, she quickly explained. Wu Wenjing was leaning against the doorway, urging her to come over. Ah, so that's why. Listen, I'm not in the country right now, but I might be back by next week, he replied. Plus, I think this has more to do with fourth brother's business than my own. It's best if the two of you would talk it out. I already told him, but all he said was that I could throw it away. Knowing that Cheng Mu wouldn't be able to do much, she could only thank him and hang up on the phone. With a sigh, she gazed up at the ceiling, squinting her eyes as the artificial lights flashed before her. It seemed that she had to do this on her own. Wu Wenjing pressed her stomach, peering at her friend's face. Yen, hurry up. If we're late, there wouldn't be much food left for us. I'm coming. Locking her bag in the drawer, Jian Yun grabbed her phone and walked up to her. Were you just calling Assistant Cheng? Wu Wenjing asked curiously, bumping her shoulder against hers. What's that about? Jian Yun snorted as she walked right ahead, leaving her friend behind. Didn't you say you were hungry? Let's head to the canteen already. Aya, you little witch, don't keep me on the edge of my seat and tell me. With her curiosity already piqued, Wu Wenjing ran after her. The two women laughed as they entered the elevator, not noticing that the manager's office had silently opened behind them. Once she was sure that they were gone, Xie Bingbing stepped out of her office. Her arms were crossed over her chest as her long fingernails scraped against her sleeves. A dangerous look flashed on her face. Sister Bingbing, is that the bitch you were just talking about? Behind her was an ordinary-looking woman wearing a pile of heavy makeup on her face. She stared at their retreating figure with a curious look etched on her features. Hui, you heard it too, right? Xie Bingbing scoffed, glaring at the elevator, silently wishing that the contraption could burst into flames. She's been talking to Cheng Mu just now about giving something to Lian Cheng. She even said that the item was far too expensive and that she couldn't accept it. Hui nodded rapidly in agreement, furrowing her eyebrows. Sister Bingbing, do you think Mr. Huo really gave her something precious to him? Xie Bingbing's face had turned so dark that the woman had immediately quieted down. Go and see what it is. She raised her chin up in the air. As they stepped towards Jian Yun's desk, Hui tried to pull open one of the drawers, only to shake her head in defeat. It's locked. There must be another way. Grinding her teeth together, the woman pulled her branded bag up her shoulders. Pick the lock for me. I want to see what prized treasure Lianqing had given her. But Sister Bingbing, that's illegal. I can't. Although Hui was her follower, she wasn't that stupid. With all the surveillance cameras poised around every corner of the room, they'd be easily seen. They were already going too far. What are you so afraid of? If something happens, then I'll handle it for you. Xia Bingbing rolled her eyes. With her grandfather being the chairman, she had this entire company in the palm of her hands. One word from her and her grandfather would happily follow. Liancheng hasn't been paying attention to me since I got here, so it must be because of that bitch. I want to know what he gave her. Ming's was a large company, so many of their furniture and fixtures were made with the highest quality of wood and metal. No matter how much Hui tried to pull it open, the drawers still wouldn't budge. She could only helplessly shake her head. Sister Bingbing, she protested. I really can't open it. Why are you so useless? Pushing her away, Xie Bingbing tried to pull the drawer open with all her limited strength, and when it still didn't budge, she proceeded to try and kick it open. Yet, no matter how hard she kicked, the drawer remained close. Around 20 minutes had passed, and they still couldn't see what's inside the locked drawer. Sister Bingbing, please don't do this. If someone sees you, it wouldn't be good for you, Hui tried to convince. Her family wasn't as well off, but she wanted to experience higher luxuries in life. This was why she decided to hang around Xia Bingbing and do her bidding, in order to get the leftovers of the woman's accessories and makeup. Although her life seemed piteous, it was better than settling in the slums. Xia Bingbing glanced at the clock, knowing that the people would be back soon. If they saw her picking the locks, it would definitely ruin her name even further. Although her father held a high position in this company, it still wouldn't be able to protect her from the criticism she'd face within the workplace. Hiding a snarl, She turned around. Sister Bingbing, Ming's is amazing. Hui sighed in envy, gazing at the high ceilings and bright walls. If only I could work here. Please, entering is easy. Hand over your resume tomorrow, and I'll ask the HR department to pull some strings for you. Xie Bingbing rolled her eyes and waved her hand. Half an hour later, Jian Yun and Wu Wenjing returned from lunch. However, the sight that had greeted them was one belonging to a crime scene. Although the drawers were still locked, Jian Yun's table had been flipped over, with all her supplies scattered across the glass tiles. Chapter 48, The Incident of the Control Room. Oh my god, Yun, check if anything has gone missing. Wu Wenjing broke out in a cold sweat, remembering the priceless diamond that Huo Liancheng had given to Jian Yun. Her hands twitched at the sight of her friend's scattered belongings and moved drawers. It was obvious that someone was searching for something, and what else could that someone be searching for if not for the most expensive thing hidden inside that desk? When the other employees heard Wu Wenjing's cry, they immediately crowded around her. They peered into the cubicle, gasping at the sight. It truly was as if they were entering an ambush with how chaotic everything looked. What's wrong? Was something stolen? I don't know if something was stolen or not, but look at her table. It's obvious that someone was trying to break into something. Stroking her chin, she observed the faded fingerprints on the lock and the padded footprints on the tiles. She bent over to take a closer look. It was like seeing a female version of Sherlock Holmes strutting into the office. Look, its heels. The footprints are heel marks. The culprit is a woman. Yun, check your wallet. Sister Xiao, an older staff member, sighed, rubbing her forehead. In all her experience, she had never seen such a thing happening inside the office. If there's anything missing, you should file a police report. Jian Yun unlocked her drawer and drew out her bag. Since there were tons of people surrounding her, she couldn't just take everything out to check if the diamonds were still there, so she had to cover it up by pretending to inspect her purse. While everyone was distracted, her other hand slipped inside her bag and searched for the jewelry box. As her fingers grazed against a velvety surface, she nodded at Wu Wenjing's direction, without batting an eyelid. The necklace was safe and sound. Her friend's shoulders sagged in relief as she patted her chest. Well, is anything missing? One of the staff members stepped closer in concern. She was about to reply when Xia Bingbing walked closer towards the crowd. The woman had a dark look on her face as she regarded all her subordinates. Immediately, the loud chatter had quieted down as everyone shared a look. Isn't it the end of your lunch break? She glared at them. Why are you all gathering around here? Manager Xia. Someone tried to pry open Jian Yun's desk. We think a thief had snuck in, one of the staff members explained, while the rest had taken interest in the floor. After all, although they didn't like her, they didn't have the nerve to go against her as well. What? A thief? An unreadable expression flashed in Xia Bingbing's eyes as she turned around. Why don't you search your bag to see if there's anything missing? Nothing's missing. Jian Yun responded. Why don't I take a look for you? Before she could explain any further, Xia Bingbing already grabbed a hold of her bag. If there's anything missing, we'll have to file a police report, especially if anything valuable has been stolen. Snatching her bag back from her sharp fingernails, Jian Yun snapped. I already said that there's nothing missing. I don't need you to worry about it, Manager Xia. I'm already trying to help you out. What? Do you have anything to hide? The woman curled her lips in disdain. Her beauty was hidden underneath her feral eyes and gritted teeth. Truly, at this stage, she looked far more like an animal rather than a woman, with the way she was acting around them. Is this the way you talk to your manager? This is my bag, and therefore I can do whatever I want with it. Retorting, Jian Yun narrowed her eyes. Why are you so nervous? Do you happen to know anything about this? How the hell would I know? Xia Bingbing's voice became a little pitchier. If you don't know, then why are you acting so invested in this? It kind of makes you a little bit suspicious, don't you think, Manager Xia? Having enough of Xia Bingbing's attitude, she decided to speak out. The scattered desk was definitely not an accident. It was far too coincidental that her desk was the only one that was searched out of everyone else in the office. Besides, the way she had tried to rob Jian Yun's bag showed that she knew something about the lover's heart. After all, if she really was the granddaughter of the chairman, she would have been in contact with many influential people in Qinghu City. Sooner or later, the news of Huo Liancheng gifting Jian Yun the lover's heart would have already reached her ears. And knowing her, she wouldn't stand for such a thing from happening. Jian Yun, why don't we just check the surveillance cameras and find out who was in the office? Wu Wenjing deliberately suggested, glancing at Xia Bingbing. Not having any ill intentions, Sister Xiao immediately agreed. That's right. If this person has the guts to do this the first time, then she'd definitely be at it again for the second round. It's better if we let everyone know who this person is once and for all. She then turned around to address her coworkers. In the future, everyone needs to be careful of their money or valuables, okay? Better safe than sorry. The two women exchanged glances, nodding. Sister Xiao's words make sense. Perhaps we should go to the control room later on, find out who the real culprit is. Definitely, Wu Wenjing nodded. Once we find out, we should inform President Huo and perhaps even post it on the internet. With such a scandal, I wonder what this would do to his reputation. Both of them noticed the way Xia Bingbing had frozen at the mention of President Huo. It seemed that this woman wasn't that crazy after all. As things started to calm down, everyone slowly returned to their respective cubicles. Only Xia Bingbing was left behind as she stood in front of Jian Yun, seemingly in a daze. Manager Xia, is there anything else? From the look on the woman's face, Jian Yun was almost certain that she was the one who had flipped her table today. Otherwise, she wouldn't have looked so guilty. Acting unaffected by her words, Xia Bingbing shot her one last glare before heading out of her cubicle. Her 10-centimeter heels clicked against the tiles as she retreated. Even then, that still wasn't enough to fool Jian Yun. A few minutes had passed and Wu Wenjing used this time to run over and whisper in her ear. Yun, that Xia bitch just snuck out right now. I tried to see where she was heading, and guess what? She's heading to the second floor. Everyone who worked at Ming's knew that the second floor was the security management center. Not only did it hold the security guard's lounge, but it also held the monitoring and control room, where they keep track of their surveillance cameras. Let's go too. Locking her drawer once more, Jian Yun pulled out her phone and raced towards the elevator. By the time they had finally reached the second floor, the elevator doors had opened to reveal Xia Bingbing standing right before them. When the older woman caught sight of Jian Yun, a flash of nervousness could be seen in the corner of her eyes, one that the two had caught. What a surprise! Wu Wenjing mocked, resisting the urge to roll her eyes at the woman. Are you also here to see who opened Yun's drawer? What does that have to do with me? Xia Bingbing scoffed, regaining her composure. I lost my necklace? That's why I came to see who else entered my office this morning. Did you find out who stole your necklace then? Jian Yun seared. With an unladylike snort, Xia Bingbing pushed past the two of them and headed straight to the elevator. Once they were finally left alone, Wu Wenjing threw her arms up in the air. That woman's such a bitch. How the hell did President Huo fall for someone like her? She shuddered. Do you think he's poisoned or something? Not wanting to talk about them anymore, Jian Yun pulled her towards the control room. Come on, let's go take a look. However, just as she had expected, the security guard in charge had already informed them that Xia Bingbing had transferred the footage into her USB and deleted the one in the surveillance camera. Now, they were left with absolutely no proof. I'm sorry, he had apologized, but there was really nothing else he could do about it. After all, how could someone of his stature speak against the manager herself? Back in the elevator, Wu Wenjing stomped her foot in frustration. What do you plan to do now? What else can we do? If she really is the chairman's granddaughter, then I can't really do much, can I? Jian Yun sighed, running a hand down her hair. Plus my things weren't lost, and all the evidence we have is in her hands. So what, we're just gonna forget about it? Didn't she say that she also lost her necklace? Let's see what tricks she have in her sleeves this time around. Thinking for a moment, she bit her lips. The best we could do is to be a bit more vigilant. When they returned to the HR department, Sister Xiao and the others gathered around to ask Jian Yun if she already knew who the culprit was. Although she didn't say a word, Wu Wenjing intercepted their discussion. We were about to see the footage if Manager Xia hadn't deleted the original footage. The entire staff room became quiet. Although everyone knew exactly who the culprit was and what had actually happened, none of them had the nerve to say it out loud in fear of attracting the woman herself. For the next few days, the office was silent, and Xia Bingbing made no other move but glare at them whenever she walked by. However, this type of peace only unnerved Jian Yun even further. This was like the calm before the storm, and she knew for a fact that this wasn't the last time they'd see Xia Bingbing, nor was this the last time she'd mess with them. At this point, all she could do was sit back and wait. Chapter 49. Calm before a storm. Whenever Li Shangrong was still their manager, they often worked overtime, so Jian Yun was used to the heaping amounts of paperwork. Whatever documents Xia Bingbing decided to throw at them, she could easily maneuver around it, getting it done as seamlessly and perfectly as possible. Turned out their previous manager had already prepared her for the worst. Sighing, she glanced at her phone. Zhou Xiaolong had invited her out to eat several times in the past 2 days, but she was far too busy to accept his invitation. On Wednesday, while she was arranging for her schedule for the day, a voice called out for her. Jian Yun? Is there someone here by the name of Jian Yun? Wu Wenjing immediately tilted her head from the cubicle and peered at the doorway to see that it was the flower delivery services. As her sharp eyes fell on the brightly colored bouquet, her jaw fell open. Oh my gosh! Trying to stifle her squeal, she placed a hand on her mouth, but even that wasn't enough to stop her from staring in awe. They're so beautiful. Here. Jian Yun signed and accepted the bouquet. As she moved one of the roses, she saw a small card perched on top of its stems with the name Zhou written in cursives. A small smile slipped into her lips, but before she could give him a call, her phone already rang out. It was from Zhou Xiaolong. Jian Yun, I'm already in the lobby, he chirped the moment the call was connected. Let's have lunch together. Seeing as she couldn't refuse the offer anymore, she glanced up at Wu Wenjing and asked, Is it okay if I bring a friend? Of course. Once they have finished fixing up their workspace, the two women didn't go to the company's dining hall as they usually did during their lunch break. Instead, they took the elevator all the way to the first floor. I'm finally going to see what this Zhou guy is all about, Wu Wenjing teased, but before Jianyun could respond to her, the elevator doors had already opened. Zhou Xiaolong was standing by the reception table. When he saw them walking towards him, he immediately came up to greet them. It's nice to see you again. It's nice to see you too. Smiling, Jianyun motioned to her friend, introducing them to each other. Once they were better acquainted, they all headed out of the entrance. Where would you ladies like to eat? Being the courteous gentleman that he was, he turned to them. Anywhere with Sichuan food, if you don't mind. Wu Wenjing was the first to answer. As she was walking behind him, she couldn't help but eye the man from head to toe, before crossing her arms over her chest. This was the first time she had come across with one of Jianyun's dates, given that he was the only one her friend hadn't scared off with her over-the-top makeup. While he wasn't paying any attention, she leaned over to whisper, "He looks pretty good, and he's quite polite." "I think so too." Jianyun nodded, staring at him. This was one of the main reasons why she had entertained him. Although he wasn't totally her type, he was definitely a close second with his easygoing smile and sweet gestures. She could find herself liking him in due time. But, compared to President Huo, he isn't much of a viable candidate either, she said as an afterthought. The corner of Jianyun's mouth twitched, but she didn't say a word, not wanting to encourage her. But then again, I don't understand. The diamond that President Huo gave you obviously shows that he likes you and that he wants to pursue you. Even then, Wu Wenjing still didn't look as if she had gotten her point. Instead, she continued to blabber on. He's so handsome and rich, and you obviously get along with him more, right? Do we really have to talk about him here? Jianyun glanced at Zhou Xiaolong, who happened to walk right beside her. Although she wasn't sure whether he had heard their conversation or not, she couldn't help but pinch Wu Wenjing's side, shooting her a warning look. Fine, whatever. I'll discuss it with you tonight. Sticking her tongue out, Wu Wenjing got the point and quieted down. After all, there were some topics better discussed privately. Noticing that the two were glancing up at him, Zhou Xiaolong returned their gazes with a gentle smile. Wu Wenjing grew up in Sichuan, so she was really fond of spicy food. Although Jianyun wasn't fond of Sichuan cuisine at first, she had grown used to the heat after hanging around with her friend most of the time. Due to this, she now had a really high tolerance when it came to different spices. Zhou Xiaolong, however, lived near the Jianzhou area and had a penchant for the sweeter taste in life, so tolerating the heat was definitely not his forte. Sweat and tears beaded down his face as he huffed out the hot air, trying to get a hold of himself. His composed features were gone as he struggled to take another bite of meat. Jianyun and Wu Wenjing struggled not to laugh at him as they ate, and Zhou Xiaolong was a good sport about all of it. Not bothering to hide his tears, he teased, "This is by far the spiciest dishes I've ever ordered in the last 30 years of my life. Tell me, is this the reason behind your flawless skins? Ah, we're just born this way." Striking a pose, Wu Wenjing flipped her hair over her shoulders. Jianyun giggled. "Oh right, thank you for the flowers. They were lovely." "No need to thank me. As long as you like them, then I'm happy." The outline of his lips was bright red, while his entire face looked like an advertisement for chili peppers. His smile was wide as if he was trying to suck up all the cold air left from their surroundings. Afraid of busting out into laughter, Jianyun immediately lowered her head, focusing on her own plate. By the time they finished their meals, their lunch break was almost over. Zhou Xiaolong brought the two women back to the entrance of Ming's building, but before he left, he quietly asked her, "Jianyun, are you free tonight?" Sighing, she shook her head apologetically. Knowing their manager, Xie Bingbing would likely give them more paperwork to do at the last minute. That way, they'd have no other choice but to stay in and finish them. That was also one of the reasons why the staff had hated her, although none of them had the guts to actually complain about it. Although Li Shangrong was the same, at least he was more reasonable. "I've been working overtime a lot recently." She apologized. "So I don't have time in the evenings." "That's fine. How about we have lunch tomorrow then?" He nodded in understanding. "But, don't you have work to get to?" Hesitating, Jianyun glanced up at him. She knew that Zhou Xiaolong's office was located on another side of Qinghu City, and a drive to Ming's would probably take at least half an hour if he was lucky. "It's fine. I've been running a few errands in the last days, so it's really not in the way." He smiled. This time, she didn't refuse. "All right then, just be careful on your way back, okay?" After bidding farewell to Zhou Xiaolong, they finally entered the company. "Yun, did President Huo kiss you already?" Wu Wenji nudged her as they stood inside the elevator. Ever since she had heard that Huo Liancheng had given Jianyun an expensive diamond necklace, she'd been at it non-stop and trying to get all the little details from their romantic encounter. Jianyun fidgeted, focusing on the buttons. How was she going to tell her that she had forcefully kissed him while she was drunk? Or how she had forced him to carry her all the way up to her apartment, and even to her bedroom? Her cheeks colored with shame, and she ducked her head. Perhaps it was a good thing that she hadn't seen him in the last 2 days, or else she'd be at a complete loss for words. Of course not. Refusing to tell Wu Wenjing any details, she finally stepped out of the elevator. Even the thought of President Huo had sent shivers down her spine. Jian Yun was about to tease her friend until she reached her cubicle. There she saw that her documents were reorganized and her pens were tilted to the other side. It seemed that someone had moved around her desk, this time in a more subtle manner. Did Xia Bingbing try to pry the necklace from her again? Someone moved my desk, she announced. Same goes for my table, Wu Wenjing shouted, furrowing her eyebrows. That's me. A young woman giggled as she approached them, bowing her head. My name is Li Hui. I was the one who wiped everyone's tables while they were out eating. She's our new janitor, Sister Xiao butted in. Manager Xiao was the one who had invited her in. Boon for loon. Jian Yun greeted, but she already didn't trust the woman in front of her. Li Hui was wearing a pound of makeup on her face, none of them fitting her pale skin tone. Her eyes were covered with bright shadows that it almost looked like a canvas. Even if the woman had tried her best to act harmless and innocent, she still couldn't hide the shrewdness in her features, one that was enough to match a rat's face. Furthermore, she was recruited by Xia Bingbing. Jian Yun licked her lips. For the last few days, Xia Bingbing still hadn't made a move, and the silence had become unnerving than peaceful. Even then, she understood that the woman would not stop at it till she had the upper hand. After all, if the lover's heart was truly such a prized possession, she could tell that Xia Bingbing would be utterly furious if she were to have heard the news. After the lock-picking incident that day, Jian Yun didn't bring the necklace to work anymore. Instead, she hid both the earrings and the necklace in her safe. Even if she wanted nothing to do with them, she couldn't let Xia Bingbing have it for herself. Besides, if anything, she still planned to return it to Huo Liancheng. Having it stolen wouldn't help her case. With a sigh, she turned to her desktop and continued to type. For the next 2 days, Jian Yun continually received roses from Zhou Xiaolong, and they had lunch every noon. The two had gotten to know each other a bit better, and had become quite better friends over their conversations. It was obvious that the man was quite satisfied with her wishful proclamations of seeing her every day of the week. On Friday night, the HR department was tasked to work overtime until 8. By the time they were finished, Wu Wenjing had already rushed out of her cubicle to attend to her date, leaving Jian Yun alone. Not wanting to go home just yet, she decided to walk around the sidewalk, lost in her thoughts. Ming's building was located in one of the busiest streets in Qinghu City, and at this time, it was already crowded with various people. Being surrounded by various colors and sight, she couldn't help but be alone in a large sea of strangers. A settled feeling settled in her chest as she proceeded to walk even further down the street. It was weird to feel so alone in such a loud area, and she couldn't help but wonder if there was anyone else in the world who felt the same way. Musing to herself, Jian Yun suddenly stopped by a jewelry store. Seeing her darkened reflection staring back at her, her gaze slowly rested on the diamond necklace wrapped around the model's neck. It also held a pink diamond, but it was much smaller compared to the one that Liancheng had given her. However, when she glanced at the price, she had almost jumped back in shock. She clutched her chest. The number of zeros on that thing was enough to make her faint. Jian Yun turned away and walked the other direction. However, before she could get any farther, her phone rang out. Who could that be? She peered at the screen, but once she did, her heart had stopped beating. Immediately it was as if the entire crowd had silenced all around her, and all she could hear was the soft ringing from her eardrums. It was Huo Liancheng. Chapter 50. Lying to him. Jian Yun had wanted to return the necklace ever since she had woken up from her stupor, but all he did was snap in response, telling her to just throw it away if she didn't want it. After that, Huo Liancheng never tried to contact her again. It was as if everything had reverted back to normal, as if they had never met. The last few days were exactly that, yet even then, she still felt unsettled. She still couldn't help but feel a little bit perturbed with what had happened, and to have him leave it at that. Jian Yun licked her lips tentatively. There were times when she'd even catch herself scrolling down her WeChat to see if he'd reply, only to be left disappointed. But why was she even feeling this way? Wasn't no contact better? At least both of them could now move on from all the awkward instances they had shared together. However, no matter how much she thought about it, Jian Yun still didn't seem convinced. Huo Liancheng was the man of every woman's dreams. He was far too perfect with his combed-back hair and strong jawline. With his large bank account and excellent ability in generating profit, he had everything going on for him. Even Jian Yun had to admit that she couldn't help but be in awe of all of his achievements. But despite this, she knew where she stood. This wasn't a fairy tale where Cinderella puts on her ball gown and falls in love with Prince Charming. No, this was reality, where dreams go die in a hole. Her heart stirred in her chest, and she suppressed a sigh. Snapping out of her thoughts, Jian Yun glanced at her phone. It was still ringing. Not bothering to answer it, she threw it inside her bag and continued walking. The pink diamond twinkled in the back of her mind, and she ducked her head. The last thing she wanted to do was to be reminded of the necklace back at her apartment. She glanced at her bag. If she didn't answer Huo Liancheng's call, then he wouldn't call again, right? However, as a few seconds had passed, it seemed that her theory was continually proven wrong. The phone in her bag still wouldn't stop ringing, and as she walked, she was starting to notice some curious looks being thrown her way. If John Yun continued to ignore him, would he still keep calling? Not wanting to test it out any longer, she finally answered after the third ring. President Huo? Where are you? Huo Liancheng asked directly. John Yun raised her head and gazed at the bustling scene around her. Turning toward the other block, she continued walking until the loud clamors had faded into the background. I'm at home, she lied with a straight face. After all, it wasn't as if he'd know, right? There was a short pause. Why did you pick up the phone just now? I was asleep, so I didn't hear you. Jian Yun frowned. Her relationship with Huo Liancheng was definitely a site of inquiry. They weren't lovers. Hell, they weren't even friends, yet they sounded like a couple whenever they talked to each other. There were times when she'd wonder if this was proof that the man really did care for her, but every time she'd have such an inkling, his actions would prove her otherwise. Is that so? His casual voice became cold. Feeling a chill run down her spine, Jian Yun had to steady herself. There was something about the way he had twisted his words that made it seem as if he knew she was lying, but she had no other choice but to continue. Besides, she had already dug a hole for herself. It would be far more shameful if she didn't go ahead with it. What is it, President Huo? It's nothing. Huo Liancheng snapped after another moment of silence. After listening to her say goodnight, he quickly hung up, and his screen finally blackened. However, his fierce gaze wasn't directed at his phone anymore, but on a small figure on the other side of the road. He saw her insert her phone back into her bag and headed down the street. She was right in front of him, yet she had the nerve to lie and say that she had already fallen asleep. Did she really not want to see him that much? Let's head back. Turning his head, Huo Liancheng placed the box right beside him and frowned. Yes, Mr. Huo? Wang Shanzi, his driver, nodded. The middle-aged man couldn't help but peer at his rearview mirror just to get a better look at his boss's face. Originally, when he picked up Huo Liancheng from the airport, he had instructed him to drive to Ming's first. However, in a few minutes, after he had gone down, he returned and asked Wang Shanzi to circle around the area before making a brief phone call. Although he was puzzled by his boss's peculiar behavior, the old man followed suit. Besides, Mr. Huo's private matters weren't any of his concern. All he needed to do was to drive and obey his orders. After Jian Yun hung up, a sense of guilt settled in her stomach. Just then, she felt a pair of eyes glaring at her back from across the road, but when she turned around, all she could see was an unfamiliar car slowly driving away. Although she didn't recognize the car, she felt her heart skipping a few beats. Thinking that it was nothing, she heaved a sigh and walked away. When Jian Yun had finally arrived in her apartment, it was almost 10. Scanning her surroundings, there was also no sight of Luo Yanyan. It seemed that her friend also had other appointments to attend to. Planning to wash up and change, she walked up to her closet and pulled it open, only to see Liancheng's jacket hanging beside her other dresses. She stilled. It seemed that it was almost yesterday when her clothes were torn, and Cheng Mu's had handed this coat to her. Although she had already taken it to the dry cleaners, she had never gotten around to returning it to him. At first, she had assumed that the clothes belonged to Cheng Muze. After all, with Huo Liancheng's obsession with cleanliness, she didn't peg him as the type of man who would lend his clothes to a stranger, no matter how piteous she could have looked. Imagine her surprise when she was told otherwise. With a sigh, Jian Yun slid her fingers down his sleeves, stroking the fabric. No wonder Luo Yanyan had thought that she had a blind date with a rich man a few weeks ago. Looking at the intricate design alone, she could bet that this would cost thousands of yuan. Even if she worked all year round, she still wouldn't be able to buy this coat, much less own hundreds of them. As she looked at it up and down, she could deduce that Huo Liancheng was around 185 centimeters tall. The man was tall, good-looking, and rich. He had everything under his wing. How could he not have several women chasing after him? Aren't you a hypocrite? Jian Yun scolded herself, resisting the urge to snort. If Wu Wenjing and Luo Yanyan heard her now, they would have smacked her senseless. How could she even reject such a perfect man like him? You're probably the one with the problem, not him, they'd murmur in irritation upon hearing her endless complaints. It doesn't matter anyway. She rolled her eyes. Besides, he never really said anything about pursuing her. A man like President Huo could get any girl he pleased. Perhaps he was just intrigued by how she had acted around him, and all he ever planned for her was to be another notch in his bedpost. Don't all rich, privileged men think the same? But then, why would he give her the lover's heart? Of all the jewelry in the world, why would he give her something that held so much meaning? She shook her head. The more the thought resurfaced in her mind, the more her head pounded in pain. It was better to just let it be. Taking her clothes from the rack, Jian Yun closed her closet. She turned on her laptop and sat on her bed. Ever since smartphones became more advanced, her laptop had been left unused, but Jian Yun still opened it up from time to time to post on her Weibo account. Scanning her feed, she couldn't help but giggle at all the gossip that had filled up her wall. Although Jian Yun had her own battles, she was just like any other girl. She loved gossip, especially if it was about her favorite celebrities. Although she wasn't as much of a fanatic as Wu Wenjing, she still enjoyed a good article every now and then during her free time. A small smile threaded across her lips as she updated herself with all the newest trends. As she delved into her feed, she heard a sound coming from her phone. Picking it up, she saw that Chen Mu's had just sent her a message. Jian Yun glanced at the time and pursed her lips. It's already so late. Why would he be looking for her? Sister Jian, he had written. You've already received the gift, right? Do you like it? Gift? She furrowed her eyebrows. Fourth brother went to find you as soon as we got off the plane. Didn't he give it to you? I didn't see him. After Jian Yun sent the message, she couldn't help but remember the unfamiliar car that had driven right past her. She shuddered. It was rare to see such luxurious cars in Qinghu City, especially around such a busy district. Plus, there was something about the way she had felt down the alleyway that made her feel a bit off. Was he in that car this entire time? Was this the reason he started snapping at her when she said that she had been sleeping with him? Her heart thumped loudly in her chest, and she couldn't help but feel a little bit guilty. Pity. And here I thought I'll be seeing your surprised face tonight. Chen Mu's teased, unaffected by her response. Thinking about it, she couldn't help but ask, do you mind if I ask why he gave me a present? He had already given her a diamond necklace, and now it seemed that he had brought her another present from abroad. Jian Yun leaned against her pillows, feeling a little bit faint. Why was he doing this? You'll have to ask fourth brother that. Chen Mu sent a snickering emoji, not answering her directly. Aren't you a delight? She sent a bitter emoji and slumped back on her bed. She couldn't possibly ask Huo Liansheng about the gift. Besides, it wasn't as if he had given it to her yet. What if Chen Mu's was just teasing her about it? You should head to sleep. It's already late, he responded with a smiley face. Rolling her eyes, Janine stared at the ceiling. How could she sleep now? After that revelation, different thoughts soared through her mind as she tried to come up with a reason why Huo Liansheng would even think of buying her a gift. Giving up, she decided to text Wu Wenjing. If a guy keeps sending you gifts, what does that mean?